So, hello everybody, welcome. Thank you for being here, and today's program is live streamed, so I want to start on time because we have people who are sitting at their computers watching. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nancy Lipsey. I'm the Senior Director of Programs for the Boulder JCC. We acknowledge that here in Boulder, we are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of Native peoples, including the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations. We acknowledge that the original inhabitants in Boulder and in all parts of the United States have a deep connection to all aspects of the environment, including the lands, waters, and animals that sustain life. In a minute, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Thomas Pegalo Kaplan, the Lewis P. Singer Endowed Chair in Jewish History at CU, and our partner on this program this afternoon, to introduce our speaker. But first, I want to let everyone know that this program and all Holocaust education programs that we offer at the Boulder JCC are supported by the Ilona Irene Rosenshine Holocaust Education Endowment Fund. That's a mouthful. This fund was launched in 2019 with a generous donation from Larry Cohn to honor Irene and her contribution to Holocaust education in the Boulder community. Since the start of the fund, we've been offering about 1 to 3 programs a year in Holocaust education, and we will continue to do so. They've been varied and very interesting, and we look forward to lots of new opportunities this year and into the future. If you are interested in learning more about the fund and how you can contribute, please contact Heidi Dormady or any of our Boulder JCC staff people who'd be happy to tell you more about it. We're glad that we were able to offer this program as a live stream, and there will be a recording as well that we will make available, and it will be on our YouTube channel. When we have Q&A at the end of the program, I will have a microphone so that you can ask questions. It's important that we use the microphone so that the live stream audience can hear you. Even though our speaker will be able to hear you, the live stream will not. So let's use the microphone. Following the presentation, I hope that you'll stick around. We have some lovely refreshments and gives us all a chance to talk and socialize and also unpack all the interesting things that we learned today. So I'd like to turn it now over to Thomas.
Okay, thank you so very much, Nancy, and welcome to all of you. Welcome, of course, especially to the people here. Welcome to the people on the various computer screens, and of course, a very warm welcome, and we are very excited to have our distinct guest of honor all the way from Canada via Los Angeles, and of course I introduce her to you in just a second. My name is Thomas Pegalo Kaplan, and I'm the Singer Endowed Chair in Jewish History, a recent addition to the faculty on campus, of course, not too far away from here. I arrived last year, so it's a special pleasure and honor to be working both with Nancy Lipsey and of course also with Jonathan Leff and all the great many people here at the JCC. So we're very grateful for this joint program, and of course there are going to be many more, at least so I hope, and I'm looking forward to do it. So real quick, in addition to the various supporters and donors whom Nancy already mentioned, was also of course like to add, in addition to the JCC, that the Department of History from the University of Colorado at Boulder is one of our co-sponsors, so of course is the program in Jewish Studies, so is the Department in Women's and Gender Studies, and also the Center for Humanities and the Arts, as well, of course, a special thank you to all the donors and the supporters, especially of the program in Jewish Study. Okay, so now you're certainly in at this lunchtime time, of course, we are marking Yom HaShoah beginning tonight for a special treat by a very good friend and distinguished scholar who is going to take you on a very kind of insightful elaboration in just a few seconds. So we're going to keep this brief because you're here not to hear me introduce our distinguished guest, but of course to hear her speak. So Professor Dorota Glowacka is a professor of humanities at the University of King's College, which is in Halifax, Canada, where she teaches critical theory, gender theory, and of course Holocaust and genocide studies. Professor Glowacka is the author in Polish now. I'm going to give you the English one. From the Other Side, Testimony, Fact, Imagination came out in Warsaw in 2017. Of Disappearing Traces, Holocaust, Testimonials, Ethics, and Aesthetic came out with Washington University Press in 2012. She co-edited Imaginary Neighbors, Mediating Polish-Jewish Relations After the Holocaust with Nebraska in 2007, and also co-edited edited between Ethics and Aesthetics, Crossing the Boundaries with SUNY in 2002. She also edited a special issue of Culture Machine entitled Community in 2006, and also a special issue on sexuality and the Holocaust in the Journal of Holocaust Research, which is forthcoming later this year. Professor Glowacka has published numerous book chapters, journal articles, reviews, encyclopedia entries in areas of critical theory, gender theory, Holocaust studies, genocide studies, given countless talks, both here, Canada, Poland, Europe, the list goes on and on and on. I also would like to mention that she is a member of the academic committee of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Research, which of course is at your United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. One of her current projects focuses on gender and genocide, on the intersection of the Holocaust and settler colonial genocides in North America, and this is in fact where she's going to be taking us now, very fittingly, as we're beginning to mark Yom HaShoah. So the stage is all yours. Let me invite you, of course, to get us started here, and welcome again.
Thank you very much. I am so excited to be in Colorado, finally. This is my first time. And I'm also very honored to be here on this very special day. And I'm grateful to Nancy Lipsett and the Jewish Community Center in Boulder for inviting me. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to my esteemed colleague, Thomas Pegalo-Kaplan of the Jewish program at University of Colorado at Boulder. Thank you so much. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today on traditional territories and ancestral homelands of Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. And the university where I come from is situated on traditional ancestral territories of the Mi'kmaq. The territory is called Mi'kmaqi, and the territory is covered by peace and friendship treaties by which we are all obligated, and I feel obligated by them myself. And it is especially important for me to acknowledge that when I give talks about the Holocaust, because I do believe that various instances of genocide and mass violence are deeply interconnected across history and across geographies, and I will be addressing it today. These instances are always fueled by racial and ethnic and religious hatred. Although, of course, the events of the Holocaust, the near annihilation of the Jews of Europe, and mass violence against indigenous peoples in North America are very different historical events. But nevertheless, today, I would like to draw attention to some similarities, or what I call intersections, and I do believe that we can learn, myself as a Holocaust scholar, we can learn a lot from engaging in a dialogue with our indigenous colleagues. I will be speaking primarily about cultural destruction of Eastern and Central European Jews. And I will speak from the perspective of my work as a Holocaust scholar, but I also will be speaking from the point of view of a daughter of a Holocaust survivor. On this special day, on Yom HaShoah, I'd like to dedicate everything I talk about to the members of my family who perished, murdered by the Nazis, to the members of the Yasem, Stadter, Haas, and Rostau families. They were murdered in the camps of Bełżec and Auschwitz, and in the ghettos of Kraków and Płaszów. So I am a Holocaust and genocide scholar, but everything I talk about is also part of my family history. So these two are deeply intertwined. And I'm saying it, so I would like to begin, because it is Yom HaShoah, I'd like to begin with telling you a little bit about my family history, not only to share it because, yes, my purpose is commemorative, but I hope that if I tell you a little bit about my family, it will also perhaps make it clear why I'm so passionate and dedicated to the topic I want to talk to you about. And these are images from the Museum Memorial at the site of the Bełżec killing center. It's in southeastern Poland. And that's where most of my relatives on my father's side were murdered. It was a killing center. There were very few survivors. And in Poland, you can probably hear my accent. That's where my name comes from. That's where my accent comes from. In Poland, before the war, there were about 3,300,000 Jews living in Poland, which was almost 11% of the population. And only 270,000 approximately survived. It is not widely known that out of those 270,000, 200,000 survived in the area of the former Soviet Union. So either they escaped across the river or they were deported to the Soviet gulags, which were very harsh, but they were not killing centers. So that's how many Polish Jews survived, which means that only 70,000 out of over 3 million survived in either Nazi killings, survived either the killing centers or survived in hiding. So it is a minuscule, minuscule percentage. And on this day, I'd like to share with you this picture that among those very few survivors was my family. These are my grandparents and my father, who is in the middle, and my uncle Marek. And the entire nuclear family survived. I don't know another one. That there were definitely very few instances of an entire nuclear family surviving. So I do realize what miracle it was. Maybe I just explained that before the war, my family lived in Kraków. And when the orders came in March 1941 for all the Jews of Kraków to go to the ghetto, my grandfather made a decision that they will go into hiding. And my grandfather, whose family was assimilated, unlike my grandmother's, had a lot of Polish friends. So they helped him find hiding places for all 4 of them. And they got the so-called Aryan papers, so they were hiding in plain sight, you can put it that way, and sometimes sort of going into hiding and staying places for months. But besides these 4 family members, the majority of my family were murdered. And there were 2 cases. Well, I will just share one more picture. This is my great aunt, Natalia Karp. It's a well-known story. Natalia survived the infamous camp of Płaszów. You may have seen Schindler's List. She was a well-known concert pianist before the war, and when she came to Płaszów with a transport, the horrible Amon Goth, it was his birthday, and he asked if someone could play the piano, and she stepped out. That's why she survived. However, this is my great-grandmother, Fania Stadter, and her grandson, Loniek. They were both murdered by the Nazis. I'm mentioning it because one of the uncles who did survive by escaping all the way to India, we found a letter that he wrote, and that's what he wrote to my uncle Marek. Only a handful of us are left out of the entire large family. All the rest perished tragically. It's sad and very, very painful. I can't calm myself down for a moment, especially when I think about my beloved Lonyu. It brings me to the verge of madness. So again, they survived in different hiding places, and they had to change them several times. And we have calculated that my father survived thanks to at least 12 righteous Gentiles who were giving him shelter, although most of them didn't know he was Jewish. But Mrs. Zofia Topinska, the righteous among the nations, hid my father for several weeks together with 11 other people in her apartment in Warsaw at great risk to herself, of course. So I do know some stories about my father's experiences during the Holocaust, but he didn't talk about it until 1997, and it took him even longer. Mind you, he stayed in Poland after the war, which is again quite rare, and it took him even longer to tell me what he experienced in 1968, which is a wave of anti-Semitic violence in Poland, so-called March 1968, and my father referred to 1968 as his second Holocaust. And that's more or less all I know about my family history. I know very little, although apparently my father said that my family lived in Poland for centuries. Probably they came already in the 12th century. And we tried, we looked, we did genealogical research, but we know so very little. And also, until recently, I knew very little about 1,000-year-long Jewish history in Poland, and that's what I'd like to address today. And you may have seen pictures of dilapidated cemeteries in Poland. This is one of them. Some of them have been restored. This one hasn't. This is in the little town of Baranów. I was there when the picture was taken. It took us a few hours sort of wading through the thickets to find it. No one could tell us where it was. And it was kind of located on the outskirts of the town. So I hope you can see the kind of silhouette of the matseva that is sort of overgrown by grass. So what this image evokes for me, and what I'm trying to draw attention to, is that the Holocaust is usually commemorated as mass murder on an unprecedented scale. And we want to remember and say never again. But when we only remember the murder of people, what I think we often forget is that the Holocaust was also a systematic, deliberate destruction of the Jewish culture, of the entire Jewish heritage, of the heritage of my ancestors, of which, ashamedly, I know so little, and so do very many people like me. So this is why, in addition to the physical assault on Jewish lives, which is how we usually understand the Holocaust, I would like to introduce the concept of cultural genocide and cultural destruction. And I am borrowing the term from my indigenous colleagues and indigenous writers who use the term, or have been using this term, to draw attention to colonial destruction of indigenous communities by means often not only mass killings, but actually primarily, especially in Canada, forcible assimilation, of which residential or boarding schools were the main vehicle, but also prohibitions on practicing ceremonies, prohibitions on speaking languages, etc. Although the term, and I say more about that, but the term cultural genocide was first coined by a Polish Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, who was also a Holocaust survivor, and he's referred to as the father of the Genocide Convention. The term cultural genocide is not commonly used in reference to the Holocaust. except to the best of my knowledge in one essay that was written in 2019 by Laura Bilski and Rahel Klagsburg. And I say about that a little bit more. But I would like to now give you a greater sense of the scope of cultural destruction in addition to the murder of the Jewish people, which was so unimaginable and so horrifying. I also want to convey to you how deliberate this cultural destruction was on the part of the Nazi regime. It wasn't just a kind of side effect or corollary of mass killings. It was a very deliberate tool of the genocide of the Jewish people. And maybe I just quote from a collection of notes that were written between 1941 and 42 by Rabbi Ephraim Oshry, who was the only rabbi who survived from the Kovno ghetto. And Rabbi Oshry, in his notes that he was writing at the time of the events, laments. He says, "The world that once was no longer is. Gone are the holy communities, the sainted Jews, the children and the mothers, the rabbis, the libraries of thousands of sacred books. Our world is forever gone." So there is this kind of heart-wrenching feeling that the entire world of Central and Eastern European Jews was swallowed up by an abyss. And I'm sure you have read Holocaust memoirs, and that kind of horrifying feeling of this gaping void often is reiterated in these memoirs. Maybe I will quote from one, and that's from Holocaust survivor Nate Leipziger. The memoir was published in 2015. I will say more about that later. But Nate Leipziger went back to his hometown of Chorzów. He steps off the bus, he looks around looking for the synagogue, and he just sees this empty place, and he says, "The world of my childhood had vanished, as had the people." But again, when I kind of think back to the history of my ancestors, hundreds years old, I think that no matter how heart-wrenching and mournful these invocations are, they just cannot convey what it means that there is nothing, literally, almost nothing, this kind of gaping void where once this rich and complex and diverse Jewish culture used to thrive. As Thomas mentioned, I'm affiliated with the Holocaust Museum, and I spend a lot of time there. I was just there in December, so these pictures are from December this year. And every time I go, it's really painful to me to see that the 1,000 years of Jewish culture in Central and Eastern Europe is represented in that museum by a few photographs. I don't think you can see the details. These are very, very well-known photographs by Roman Wiśniak. I can say more about them later if you'd like to know. So there's just a handful of photographs. They are placed in a kind of small gallery, kind of antechamber, if you wish, that leads to this iconic Tower of Faces. If anyone has been to the Holocaust Museum, you probably remember it. The Tower of Faces is a kind of photographic memorial that was created by Yafa Elia, a survivor, sole survivor of the town of Aishishki, and she collected these photographs, and I don't know how well you can see, I apologize that maybe the photograph is not large enough. Toward the end, it kind of leads to this emptiness, like the emptiness into which, the thousands of Aishishki Jews disappeared. And there's this empty space where Aishishki Jews once lived and flourished. But again, to me, this space is so small. Okay? It's kind of shrunk to the frame of the Wiśniak photograph. So what I'd like to convey is that Nazi Germany's campaign of annihilation involved, again, not only the killings, but also this deliberate destruction of Jewish cultural heritage. And I'm sure you have seen images of burning synagogues. That's the one in Siedlce, Poland, December 1939. And this pattern of cultural destruction was actually consistent with genocidal campaigns prior to the Holocaust, such as in Armenia, 20 years prior, or in the Balkans in 1995. Okay, always a kind of deliberate attack on cultural symbols. So in Germany already in the 1930s, when the Nazis came to power, they embarked on this effort to destroy Jewish books, libraries, places of worship, and these actions preceded the assault on Jewish lives and was often carried out in the form of public spectacles, which means that they had an important symbolic function. Because within the Nazi worldview, this kind of idea of the future German Empire was that it needs to be purified of this kind of racial, quote unquote, and cultural impact of what they considered to be a parasitical culture. So you can say that the burnings of synagogues and the burning of books had this kind of function of, you can think of like symbolic purification of the German space, Lebensraum, and of the German national body, of what was considered to be these threatening Jewish cultural markers. And the practice was very methodically implemented by Reich Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, and this promulgation of the law for the protection of German blood and honor, part of Nuremberg laws, was preceded by the drawing of blacklists of authors that were then removed from libraries, by the cleansing of libraries of the un-German content, and so forth. So rewriting this history of Germany in the image of the superior Aryan race required this reinvention of the German past that would be devoid of Jewish cultural influence. And the territorial conquest went hand in hand with a kind of reconfiguration of the geographies of history and memory, reinvention of the German past. And it was achieved by means of this symbolic conflagration of Jewish cultural and religious objects. And throughout the 1930s, Jewish cultural influences were systematically purged. As we said, libraries were emptied out of books by Jewish authors, Jewish publications were forced to discontinue, art collections were Germanized, music by Jewish composers was banned, Jewish performers were not allowed to appear before German audiences, and so forth and so forth. And that, of course, became exacerbated after after Germans invaded Poland, and Jewish communities were relocated to the ghettos. The special arson squads, German arson squads, were assigned to collect books and either burn them or pulp them. Books document sacred scrolls. And then the campaign of mass murder intensifies after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. And Jewish cultural heritage in all the areas in the East is systematically obliterated at an increased pace and with increased fervor. On April 27, 1942, Alfred Rosenberg, a Nazi ideologue who was in charge of a special task force created for the purpose of cultural destruction, sent a memo. And in that memo, he sent it to all German officers on the Eastern Front, and he instructed them to, I quote, destroy those spiritual weapons of our philosophical enemies. And again, it was implemented systematically. This is the building of the Jewish Rabbinical School in Lublin, in southeast of Poland. The building is actually still standing today and is the site of the Jewish community in Lublin. In his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, in which Lemkin first used the term genocide, Lemkin quotes an article that appeared in 1941 in a German newspaper, Frankfurter Zeitung, which described the burning of the holdings of this great Talmudic library of the Jewish Theological Seminary in Lublin, Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin. So I quote after Lemkin here. For us, again, Germans, it was a matter of special pride to destroy the Talmudic Academy, which has been known as the greatest in Poland. We threw out of the building the great Talmudic library and carried it to the market. There we set fire to the books. The fire lasted for 20 hours. The Jews of Lublin were assembled around and cried bitterly. I have a hard time reading it. I love books, and we know what books mean to us and what the Torah means to the Jewish people. So I feel like the words are like turning to ash in my mouth when I read that quote. We also know today, it was in a German newspaper, it was a kind of propaganda piece, although this destruction indeed take place. Many of the books were burned, although we now know that quite a few survived and they are dispersed. Quite a few are in Iwo in New York, some in Warsaw at the Jewish Historical Institute, etc. However, only these 5 books are now in Lublin. So out of hundreds of thousands of volumes, it was one of the greatest repositories of Jewish learning in Eastern and Central Europe, and only these 5 books are back in Lublin, and they are in the care of the Jewish Community Center in Lublin now. So this violence of the assault on the Jewish cultural heritage was compounded by the fact that librarians, scholars, and other custodians of Jewish culture had to participate in it on the pain of death, and the members of the local Jewish communities were forced to witness the spectacles, as you heard in that quote. And this is Herman Kruk, who was a librarian at the famous Strachsun Library in Vilna, Lithuania. And Vilna was the heart of Jewish learning in the East. It was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania. And Herman Kruk kept a diary throughout the events, and he recorded day by day the losses of cultural treasures. If you are interested, you can read that diary. It has been translated. It was originally written in Yiddish, Togbuch for Wiener Ghetto. And in the entry from March the 12th, 1942, Kruk describes his visit to the Yiddish Scientific Institute in Vilna. Iwo was relocated to New York. And Kruk writes, "Yesterday I saw the picture that truly crushed me. The cellar is stuffed from top to bottom. I stepped on the excellent card catalog of the Bibliographical Center. The cards are lying in a heap 1/2 meter high. Underneath are pictures, works of art, young Adler, 2 soldiers. The books from the library shelves, which are in the same cellar, are strewn and confused, piled more than 1 meter high. Between cabinets are letters, documents, photographs, pictures, etc." And these are truly mournful descriptions, and Kruk draws parallels between the murder of the books and the mass killings of the Vilna Jews. Daily executions were taking place at this killing site of Ponary near Vilna. And Kruk writes, "The death throes of the Jewish Scientific Institute are not only long and slow, but like everything, here it dies in a mass grave, along with scores and scores of others. The library, the documents, the archives are all mixed up in one mess. The mass grave, the scrap paper, grows bigger and bigger." Maybe I would just quickly add that again, the destruction is very systematic, but I also showed an image of a dilapidated cemetery. And if you read the memoirs, especially from the East, and also in Kruk, they usually end with a heart-wrenching description of the razing to the ground of the Jewish cemetery. So it wasn't enough to destroy the libraries and burn the books, but the kind of last act of destruction was the destruction of the Jewish cemetery in town, as if to erase, not only to murder the Jews and destroy the culture, but also erase all the traces of the Jewish past and also the possibility of the Jewish future. But let me just add regarding the Strachsen Library in Iwo that why this Jewish cultural heritage was destroyed and like systematically obliterated. At the same time, a section of this Rosenberg's task force was at work looting the most precious books, documents, or artifacts, and they were taking them to Germany with the purpose of the future research of what they hoped would be extinct people. Right? There was supposed to be a museum of extinct people in Prague. And in Vilna, for instance, a group of Jewish intellectuals, which included Hermann Kruk, but also a well-known Yiddish poet, Abraham Sutzkever, and others, was forced to sort out these most valuable books to be sent to Germany, and then they had to destroy the rest. And in a way, it's somewhat ironic that many of those cultural treasures and books survived only because they were destined for this museum of extinct people. But the paper brigade that is sorting the books here also engaged in acts of heroic, I call it cultural resistance. So they were smuggling these books and documents one by one, hidden on the bodies out of the ghetto. And then when the war ended, they had to do it again. They had to smuggle them out of the Soviet Union and across Europe. And that's how many of these books survived. And the smuggling of the Iwo and Strachsun collections by the members of the paper brigade out of the ghetto, that became legendary. And again, you can read it in Kruk's memoir. There is also a book by historian David Fishman. It's called The Book Smugglers. I really highly recommend it. So that's a powerful example of coordinated cultural resistance during the Holocaust, which also needs to be commemorated. Another known example of such resistance, which some of you would have heard, is Emanuel Ringo Blum's archive Oinek Shabbos in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Ghetto. Maybe some of you saw the film Who Will Write Our History, perhaps, yes. It's based on the book by Samuel Kassow of the same title. I would recommend reading the book, but we can talk about that later. But there were similar efforts carried out in other cities, in Berlin, in Prague, and in so many others, about which we know very little. And again, I think they really deserve to be remembered and acknowledged. Professor of Library Studies Rebecca Knuth has proposed the term libricide, which means the killing of the books, to describe the destruction of books and libraries that is systematically carried out by genocidal regimes to advance the goals of destruction. So libricide is particularly effective as a weapon of destruction of groups whose self-identity is grounded in the tradition of writing and scriptural study and written record. The cultures for which books and libraries are, as Knuth writes, the living tissue of culture. And for these groups, the destruction of books and written material is a direct as well as symbolic assault on the very cultural and historical memory and identity. And it really targets the very core of this group's identity, as has been the case for the murdered Jews. So Knuth's coinage of this term libricide, I think, underscores how important it is that we try to find the words and concepts to describe the phenomena for which we do not have the words. And such was the case with Lemkin's invention of the word genocide. There was no concept. We need to invent it. And here, I think it's also important to think about another kind of corresponding term, which is linguicide, which I'm also borrowing from Canadian Indigenous scholars and activists. And for decades, They've been engaged in a struggle to acknowledge the not the disappearance, it was not, a natural disappearance, but the assault on indigenous languages through very deliberate policies to eradicate them. And again, primarily through forcibly sending indigenous children to residential schools where they were forbidden to speak the language. So I did some research on the assault on indigenous languages in Canada, and it led me to think about the fate of Yiddish in Central and Eastern Europe. As we know, Yiddish was the main or exclusive language of about 8 million people, which was about 85% of the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust apparently spoke Yiddish. The 1930s in Eastern Europe, however, saw the peak of Yiddish literary culture. There were so many poets, novelists, playwrights, newspapers, Yiddish theater, Yiddish historians, philosophers, all writing in Yiddish. And to a large extent, the Yiddish language provided meaning and cohesion and cultural expression to this unique and dynamic word. Historian Israeli Knox, who edited the first anthology of Holocaust literature in 1960, said that Yiddish was the essence of the civilization, its inner melody. And some Yiddish writers, like Abraham Sutzkever and Chaim Gray, they survived the war. They continued to write in Yiddish after they emigrated either to the United States or to Israel. But the readership was not very large. And the readership very quickly dwindled. And we can also think of all of these writers, Yiddish writers and poets who perished and whose name we don't even know. So we know a few names, and even the memory of them, the names are gone. So after the war, the memoirs and diaries and also collective memory books, Yitzchak that were written in Yiddish, they basically arrived in a void. They were bereft of a community that could hold on to that memory, that could provide the context and continuity for this project of memorialization and carry it on. So for the Yiddish-speaking Jews of Central and Eastern Europe, even if the books did survive, rescued miraculously, and they are preserved at YIVO in New York, and they are also preserved at some memorial sites like Yizkor books, there was no cohesive community of readers and speakers of language, not anymore. No community that could properly care for that heritage, that could pass on that cultural memory. And probably some of you read Elie Wiesel's Night. Elie Wiesel is a very well-known and much revered Holocaust survivor. The book, which we know as Night, and that was published as La Nuit in France in 1958, was first an 852-page manuscript that was written in Yiddish, and that was published in Argentina in 1954. But no one read it. And it remained completely unknown. So with the help of Francois Mauriac, when Wiesel came to France, he managed to get it published in much, much, much shortened version. And only then, he could pass on his story, but he could not have done it in Yiddish. The book had no readers. So let me also quote from an American Jewish writer, Cynthia Ozick. I think she really captures the gist of it. She wrote a story entitled Envy or Yiddish in America, and the protagonist of that story is based on a poet, well-known Yiddish poet, Jakob Gladstein. And in this kind of fictionalized account, Edelstein, based on Gladstein, he says, "And the language was also murdered. Of what other language can it be said that it died a sudden and definitive death in a given decade on a given piece of soil? And the remnants of Yiddish-speaking communities continued to shrink after the war, when the violence in Poland quickly put an end to the hope of rekindling Jewish life there. There was such hope after the war, but after 1946, the pogrom in Kielce and numerous other assaults on returning survivors, that hope was dashed. In Israel, Hebrew was adopted as the official language, and Zionist ideologies did not favor Yiddish, so again, Yiddish didn't flourish there either. So I think that what emerges in light of indigenous evocations of linguicide, which emphasizes, I think it's important not only the prohibition on speaking the languages, but what indigenous scholars draw attention to is the connection between the language and land. And Yiddish was firmly rooted in the lands where Eastern European Jews lived, where that the ancestors were buried. And it was really woven into the fabric of the society and into, there are so many Yiddish words in Polish right now, and I sometimes point it out to my friends, it's a Yiddish word, and they don't know, it's still present, although again, its presence is obliterated. So again, although Yiddish actually is no longer considered an endangered language, because there is a revival, Yiddish is being learned in Poland, although mostly by non-Jewish Poles, and it is being learned and kind of recovered in the United States, in New York, and even in Montreal in Canada, but it is no longer the melody of civilization as it used to be. So when the war ended, the destruction of Jewish life and culture in Eastern and Central Europe was also, and I know it mostly from Poland, was compounded by communist government's official historical policy of sort of assimilating the Jewish dead into the overall count of Polish victims, and in a way, excising the Jewish memory from the narrative of the war altogether. So this kind of officially mandated historical amnesia was highly successful. And it's only the last 15 years, but that's another story, that it is being recovered. And I have a slide at the end of Pauline, the history of Polish Jews, the Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. But maybe to sort of bring it closer to home, this is the great synagogue in Poznań. This is my hometown where I was born. It's a very large synagogue, and it's a large German-speaking Jewish community there. And and it is only 15 years ago, I'm ashamed to say that, but only 15 years ago, I realized that the synagogue where I learned how to swim when I was a child, that was the former synagogue. So the synagogue was converted into a swimming pool in 1942. It was used for convalescence for Wehrmacht soldiers that were returning from the front, and then it just stayed as a swimming pool. As a matter of fact, at the moment, the very, very tiny, not a single Jew from Poznań was living in Poznań after the war, not one. There is a very small Jewish community in Poznań, and they are now raising the money to convert the synagogue into a Jewish center and a museum. But it's been a very difficult endeavor. And I have one other picture to show you. I talked about the razing to the ground of the cemeteries. This is, you can't really call it a restored Jewish cemetery because it's tiny, just a few matzevas, but a renowned and legendary Rabbi Akiva Eger was buried somewhere there. So his tombstone I'm kind of standing next to is not exactly in the place where he was buried, but this is where the cemetery was. And it is very hard to find because it's in somebody's backyard, basically, so you can't even enter. But it is there. It was restored by the efforts of private individuals who were coming to pray at Akiva Eger's grave. And there is a garage on one side and a kind of garbage disposal unit on the other, but these matzevas are there. They are restored. So I hope it just kind of gives you a sense of that, not even disappearance, like entire kind of collapse, destruction of the world, of this entire civilization. I will quote from French historian Nadine Fresco. She's the author of the book, The Death of the Jews, that was recently translated into English, and she wrote, "What the Nazis had annihilated over and above individuals was the very substance of the world, a culture, a history, a way of life." And in the essay on the Holocaust and cultural genocide I quoted, Bilski and Klagsburn also write that it's not just that we don't remember the history of the destruction of the Jewish cultural heritage, but after the war, there was an effort to recover that culture. A lot of people, including Hannah Arendt, philosopher Hannah Arendt, who were making an effort for Jewish reconstruction. And a lot of these efforts have now also been forgotten. Okay? So again, another chapter of history. So in some ways, the destruction of cultures and the effort to recover that culture are not a part of a kind of mainstream Holocaust narratives. And I really would love to bring it into it. I do think that without bringing this part into Holocaust commemorative events and into the narrative of Holocaust history, I think we will continue to have a kind of really diminished idea of like the immensity and profound significance of this loss. So very quickly, I would just go back to Raphael Lemkin. Oh, sorry, that's Akiva Eger. Raphael Lemkin, the father of the Genocide Convention. As I said at the beginning, that I was drawn to this concept of cultural genocide, or rather inspired by indigenous scholars who in turn revived Raphael Lemkin's idea of cultural genocide. And my indigenous colleagues wanted to draw attention to colonialism's destruction of indigenous cultures. And indigenous thinkers remind us that Lemkin conceived of cultural destruction of targeted groups as intrinsic to genocide, not as kind of marginal event. And he proposed, when he was, of course, one of the co-writers of the Genocide Convention, in the draft he wrote, he wanted to include an article on cultural genocide. And his definition encompassed material destruction, but also non-material goods, such as language, such as traditions, such as cultural and religious beliefs. And he thought that all of those constitute the attacked group's essential identity. And Lemkin argued that the destruction of the group's cultural heritage, such as burning the Armenian churches, that was one of his examples, or the synagogues in Nazi Germany, that should always be seen as an unmistakable sign that physical assault and murder of people is coming. So I just kind of show you very quickly, I'm not going to go through these different articles of the Genocide Convention. Article 1 simply states that the genocide is a crime under international law and will be punished and persecuted. If you look at Article 2, which enumerates different acts of genocide, they do not refer to cultural destruction. You have killing of the members and deliberately inflicting conditions of life and causing bodily and mental harm, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, or number 5, which has been taken up by indigenous scholars to say what happened in residential schools, falls under Clause E of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. Then Article 3 says which acts shall be punishable. Okay? Genocide, conspiracy, direct and public incitement, complicity in genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and so forth. Conspiracy to commit genocide was then omitted in 1998 in the statutes for International Criminal Court. So conspiracy is no longer considered. However, again, nothing about cultural genocide. And this is proposed Article 3, which was not included in the final draft of the Genocide Convention. And it states, or was supposed to state, that genocide is any act committed with the intention to destroy language, religion, or culture as such, namely, prohibiting the use of language, destroying or preventing the use of library, museum, places of worship, or other cultural institutions, and subjecting the members of a group to such conditions as would cause them to renounce the language, religion, and culture. So I think you can get a sense that without that clause, the definition of the genocide as it became official when the convention was adopted in December 1948 is a much narrower definition. And there were several reasons that were mentioned during the deliberations. I won't go over it. One that, this should go under minority rights and should be covered by the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which also came out in the same year, and again, it said nothing about cultures. But it is not a coincidence that the opposition to Article 3 was mostly from the delegates from settler colonial countries like the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Sweden, and so forth. And they were concerned about the potential charges of genocide related to ongoing practices of aggressive assimilation of indigenous peoples. In the United States, also racial segregation enforced by Jim Crow. The government of Canada threatened to withdraw the support for the Genocide Convention and walk away if Article 3 were to be included, and so forth. So the only part from the original thinking about Article 3 that was to be included, it was also referring to transferring of children, but not as physical or biological destruction, but as cultural loss. Okay? When children, let's say, from Armenian homes are forcibly assimilated into Turkish homes. So that's what kind of remained. So it is clear, I think, at least I believe, that the exclusion of this Article 3 about cultural genocide from the Genocide Convention was one of the factors why there is so little, perhaps, recognition of the destruction of Central and European Jewish cultural heritage. And also Lemkin's writings, he was really trying for a much more comprehensive perspective on genocide. He regarded colonialism as a genocidal enterprise. He saw Hitler's invasion of Eastern Europe as a colonial conquest, and so forth. So once again, indigenous scholars, writers, activists, especially in the 1990s, I think it's changing right now because there's such a resurgence of indigenous culture right now. They strove to return to the spirit of Lemkin's formula of genocide, which included the annihilation of culture, because they wanted to argue that the 500-year history of destruction caused by European contact should also be recognized as genocide, even though it not always involved mass killings. So I just quote Oneida scholar Roland Christjohn. Already in 1994, he writes, "We maintain and will henceforth assume that assimilation by means of residential schools is genocide." And he says, even the phrase cultural genocide is or should be unnecessary. Cultural genocide is genocide. And there has been a lot of resistance also among Holocaust scholars to recognize colonial atrocities against indigenous peoples as genocide. And the Holocaust, the Genocide Convention comes into effect immediately after World War II, and the Holocaust continues to be a kind of model of genocide to which others are compared. And there are many differences between atrocities against indigenous peoples and the Holocaust. However, and I will just say it quickly and I'm drawing toward my conclusions, in oral depositions between the Truth and Reconciliation Commission Canada, which concluded in 2015, and also in numerous memoirs, a lot of former students or inmates of residential schools were comparing the schools to Nazi concentration camps. I will show you one image, and may be seen as controversial, but the picture, speaks 1,000 words. This is an image, it appeared in a newspaper in Chibouctouc, Halifax, during the depositions of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. And this is the Shubenacadie residential schools, an exceptionally brutal one that is, near my house. And it was kind of drawn as a concentration camp. So that was the nature of these comparisons in which these indigenous survivors were seeking to get their harm acknowledged, and in order to be heard, they were making these comparisons. So, but overall, this kind of dynamic of what I call intersecting memories of the Holocaust and settler colonial genocides in Canada, that dynamic has been asymmetrical because I have not seen references to what happened to indigenous peoples in Holocaust memoirs, so it's kind of one-sided. But I would like to give one notable exception, and I think these exceptions are kind of happening more and more often. This is Nate Leipziger, from whose memoir I quoted earlier, and I highly recommend his book, The Weight of Freedom. It's amazing. As I said, the book came out in 2015, so it took a long time for Nate Leipziger, who is still with us and is a revered member of the Jewish community in Toronto, a community leader, a wonderful person. In his book, The Weight of Freedom, toward of the book, he says that it was very hard for him to write this book because what he discloses toward the end of the memoir was that he was sexually abused in one of the camps. And this is very rare. I don't know another memoir by a May survivor who sort of writes it like that. So it was immensely courageous on Nate's part. But what he also says is, I would have never come forward with that part of my story had it not been for the example of indigenous men who gave these depositions, who spoke about it, who appeared on TV, and they were brave enough to do it. And then Nate Leipziger became the best of friends with Theodore Fontaine, whom you see here, a survivor of Ted Fontaine passed away in 2020, and he was a very good friend of mine. So it's really painful, but I think it's such a beautiful picture. And they became very close friends, and they always appeared at events together. When I wanted to invite Nate to Halifax, he said, but I'm coming with Ted, and vice versa. So they'd come together, and they would always emphasize the friendship and the mutual support. They actually appeared at Yom HaShoah events as well, and always together. So to me, this friendship is testimony to the potential of engaging in this dialogue on the intersections between the different stories of atrocity. And to me, it really shows that knowledge about the events of one historical atrocity can result in really invaluable knowledge about another historical event. And it allows us to perhaps uncover or understand more deeply past experiences that for various reasons would have remained undisclosed or suppressed or minimized. And I think that such has been the case with the recognition of cultural destruction during the Holocaust in my own research. So the recognition of cultural genocide as a central, I believe, rather than kind of collateral component of the Nazi annihilation of European Jews can situate this history more firmly within the continuum of European modernity. And that history was shaped by colonialism and destruction of indigenous communities. So rethinking the destruction of Central and Eastern European Jews through the lens of indigenous engagement with, but also recently critiques of the concept of cultural genocide, I think can contribute to a more profound recognition of the immensity of the loss of Central and Eastern European Jewish culture, but also maybe perhaps the partial recovery of that culture. And unless I think we fully integrate this loss into our memory about the Jewish catastrophe, we will continue to have, I think, a hugely diminished view of the plurality and vitality and this unfulfilled potential of that Jewish life. And maybe I'm an idealist, but in the context of current restoration projects of Jewish heritage in Central and Eastern Europe, that is Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, despite all the horrible things that are also happening in Poland right now. Maybe this will allow us to imagine some forms of Eastern European Jewish futurity, maybe Jewish cultural renewal. And I think that this project of cultural imagination expands and enriches what Raphael Lemkin once said, and I quote, to end, "Through its culture, the life of a nation continues, even when the physical life of individual members is finished." Thank you. Yes, I just need a pen.
You need a pen?
I think with a pen.
Do you have a pen? Any questions from the audience?
I found it.
You found the pen. Okay, good.
Thank you so much for listening. I know it was a lot of material. Thank you.
I have a question. I watch a lot of Antiques Roadshow.
What shows? Pardon?
It's a show called Antiques Roadshow, where people come and bring their treasures to experts who evaluate them, usually for their monetary value. And I have noticed that a lot of treasures that people bring when the program is filmed in the United States are Native American or Indigenous artifacts from Indigenous persons, either a purse or a saddle or clothing or a doll or and often the story that goes with it is something innocent. My great-great-uncle won this at a card game or bought this at a whatever. And I'm not making any judgments about any of those things, but it very much sticks with me that these are not, these were things that belonged to people that somehow came into your possession. And I'm wondering about if there's a correlation in Poland, if there were things that when books were destroyed, if things made their way, or if synagogues were looted, and that some non-Jewish people in Poland are like, oh, I have this thing that I don't know what it is, but it's been in my family, but it turns out that it's actually a Jewish artifact. That, so I was curious if there is a glut now, 75 years later, of Jewish artifacts that were not destroyed or melted down or saved for the Jewish Museum of the Lost People, but that were relieved from Polish people.
Oh. Thank you for that question. I don't know where to start. And I don't think we need to be euphemistic, okay? It was not relieving, it was obscene looting of Jewish homes, okay? And it went on in plain sight, and it was not even concealed in terms of nice words, okay? So the minute the ghetto was emptied out, the transport went on, there was, instant kind of looting. Or like in the East, where there were mass killings, just it was instantly repossessed. And very often in especially smaller, but also larger Polish towns, the houses that were kind of around the marketplace, they were Jewish homes because Jewish people often owned businesses. So to this day, you can kind of see a mark of the mezuzah that was there, right? I just remember one incident. I was in Kazimierz, which is near Kazimierz, near Lublin, not so far from Lublin. There's like a huge fair every Sunday. I went there, and of course, there is a candlestick, a menorah, and I'm like walking up. There's like, where did you get it? I was trying to be polite, but I think it was coming across, and I said, oh, I brought it from Paris. He says, I couldn't continue my inquiry, but I don't want to say in every Polish household, but maybe in every Polish household you will find, a little piece of porcelain, okay? Or like silver spoons, okay? They were often, some were looted, some were left with the neighbors to be, just kept in the absence. And they just stayed there, so absolutely. And even in that sense, it would be very important, right? Very important to kind of look at these objects. I really I also immediately thought of the similarity with indigenous objects, and once again, I do not mean to conflate these two very different histories, okay? But we know how these objects, as you say, in these stories that may have come into possession through a gift or maybe coerced gift, you don't know. The ones that are in the museums, very often burial places were looted by anthropologists and ethnographers who just took the most sacred cultural objects. Like they could take a totem pole, I'm actually citing an actual event, and not realize that the removal of that sacred object completely destroys the community. So these objects are in museums today. I actually was telling Thomas, because I'm working on a workshop that puts together the Holocaust Museum with the Native American Museum. That's happening next week. So I'm kind of really learning more about the provenance of both collections, okay? But in the case of both, what I said about the books being saved for the Museum of the Extinct People, these objects in the collections of the Native Museum in DC, they are there often because of these dubious collecting practices, but they have been preserved. So now the native tribes or indigenous peoples come from all over to the museum because some of these cultural practices have been destroyed or forgotten, and they can, like in Nova Scotia, it's basket making and the porcupine quilts embroidery, just amazing. So they are coming and they are relearning from these artifacts. So it is horrific, but there is also a possibility of kind of cultural revival.
I need you to talk into the microphone.
Oh, yes, I like to
Okay.
move around.
Sorry.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, my question, well, before I ask the question, it's a sensitive question, and so please take it in as an apologist, asking the question. But you brought up the intersection between your personal life and your personal history and your academic pursuits. And I wonder if you could perhaps unveil a little bit of yourself in terms of that intersection especially coming from Poland. Poland specifically is a sensitive issue because the little that I know of it, it must be very, very difficult being from Poland and expressing what you lost in terms of the culture and how the culture embraced so much of the destruction. And I think you get the gist.
Thank you, and also, and thank you for asking this question with so much sensitivity. I really appreciate it. About Poland, I always say there are two Polands, okay? And like the current government that came into power in 2014, it's anti-Semitic, it's xenophobic, it's homophobic, and I do not have a single good word to say about it, and I'm sorry, I wouldn't want to offend anyone, but it's horrific. There are horrible measures. There's the so-called Holocaust law that they implemented in 2018. Some of my colleagues are being like hounded in courts. I myself gave a few talks and was attacked. You know, we all suffer that fate, and you know, including death threats, and that's what it is. But then my colleagues who work on Jewish topics and learn Yiddish, they are amazing. I have friends who are school teachers, and they take, you know, the 5th graders to restore a Jewish cemetery, or at least weed it. So as I say, there are two Polands. So whether it's, I actually gave a talk in January on kind of similar subject at the University of Warsaw. I got very polite questions and not so polite questions, and it was an important conversation that, you know, I don't have anything to lose, and I put it differently. I am committed. I think I'm actually obligated to do it. And I say I'm obligated to do it because, you know, in Canada, I met people like Ted Fontaine and other friends who like really embraced me, and they embraced me as a Jew. Because when I met Daniel Paul, who was a Mi'kmaq elder, and he's very ill right now, but I'd like to say his name. He's another wonderful person. He invited me to his home. He had a bigger Holocaust library than I did. And we talked for hours. He's so knowledgeable about the Holocaust, and we've had these conversations. So as a Jewish person, as a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and as an immigrant to Canada, I am a white settler in Canada. I got a job at the university. I benefit from 300 years of horrible history of my university, so I think I have a duty. And my father passed away 7 years ago, but I started this work 12 years ago, and I was sharing it with him, and he really encouraged me. So again, to me, it's an obligation. Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And one of the fascinating things that I heard you talk about is the intersectionality between historical events. What I find perplexing is why the intersectionality between the Inquisition, Ashkenazi and Sephardic, the crypto Jews of the Southwest, parallels to the Ladino language that was lost, the phenomena about Latin American countries that I find many parallels to. And as a descendant of a crypto Jew and of just, I think, an Apache ancestry as well, I think that we could all benefit with a little bit of insights about that intersectionality between Spain and Poland.
Thank you for sharing that with me. Thank you very much. Again, I am focusing on Yiddish, and then again, I do not know enough even to address that topic and think about my Ashkenazi heritage. I have to also collaborate with experts on the subject because that's something I do not know enough about, and it's my own cultural shame that I know so little. I have not done research on the Ladino language and on the Sephardic culture in general. I hope, and I know there are experts that are doing that work, and I'm hoping that the kind of concepts I'm putting forth, and I don't think I'm the only one, will foster that kind of dialogue. But I'm also very interested in what you said about the intersections in terms of actual ancestry. And again, in some of my work, I've been also discovering colleagues who are of both Jewish and indigenous ancestry. Like in California, David Troyer, for instance, he wrote a really well-known book, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. And he's, his father is Jewish, and his mother, I'm sorry, I do not recall what nation his mother is from. But again, he's drawing on that mixed ancestry, or well-known, again, Jewish indigenous singer Tamara Podemski. We were on a panel together, and we had that kind of conversation that is also an intersectional conversation. So I'm not giving you any insights per se, but I think that these kind of ancestral, I don't know how to put it, obligations are very, very important in that dialogue. Thank you. I also actually remembered that one of my main collaborators, Lorena Fontaine, who is the niece of Theodore Fontaine, who is Cree Anishinaabe, she also has Jewish ancestry. And that kind of brought us together. So we are both, second-generation survivors. We have that dialogue, and we have that heritage, and it is our duty to amplify that conversation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So first, it was a very detailed presentation of the damage and the destruction. So first, let me just say a little about myself, because we share a lot. I'm from Poland. Yiddish was my first language. I was born after the war. We were the last religious family in the country when we left in 68. After the war, many of the cities still had Jewish schools that taught Yiddish in grammar school. And everything kind of collapsed in 68. I have a comment and a question. I think it's very important what you said, that the destruction didn't end with the war. I had traveled in Poland a number of times. Last time I was there in 2018. I, with my brother, traveled to southeastern Poland, which is where my parents came from. Many, many towns and cities and small towns have synagogues that are either in disrepair or they are used as stores. Sometimes they are renovated, used as community centers. And in some ways, it's very difficult to figure out what to do with it, because there are no people there to use a synagogue. So what do you do with it? The question I have is the following. I think that maybe we need a different word than genocide, because by having the G-E-N in the word, it really refers to persons. What we refer to as Polish culture, I think Jewish culture, many historians now use the term to describe Jews as a civilization.
Can you say that?
That describe Jews as a civilization, not Yehuda Bauer, for example, is using the term, or Kaplan, a number of others. I've heard it frequently referred to it that way. And the Polish Jewish civilization was 1,000 years old. And as you mentioned, extremely varied. There were the theological seminaries in Vilna and Lublin and many other places, and there was a vibrant movie production industry in Warsaw, and really everything in between. And I wonder whether it wouldn't be worthwhile to look to actually come up with a different word for the destruction of a civilization other than genocide that encompasses people, because obviously if you don't have people, you don't have a culture. You can destroy the culture without destroying the people, but you cannot destroy, if you destroy the people, you destroy the culture. So the Jewish Polish civilization really was destroyed, and the European Jewish culture. So in that sense, Nazis succeeded. I mean, what's left is kind of, and one example actually of what you said of the looting and et cetera, is that the Polish Museum has almost no artifacts. I mean, there are very few that show this was there and this was there. So I wonder whether that would give a different perspective if researchers thought of it as a destruction of a civilization.
Thank you very much, and thank you for sharing your own background and story. I'm very interested. Thank you so much. I would never usurp to myself, the power to invent a term that wouldn't be. Well, absolutely. But rather, what I want to say is that all the concepts, and that includes the concept of genocide, emerge in a very specific cultural, geopolitical, historical circumstance, and that was the case with the concept of genocide. I said already that Lemkin definitely meant a much broader concept of genocide, which most likely would have corresponded to what you call the murder of civilization. He really meant it in an ontological sense and kind of epistemological, cultural, definitely not in terms of just physical destruction. There are clauses that talk about annihilating foundations of life, etc., but we still understand genocide in just such a circumscribed sense. Right? So there are numerous challenges. That's why I think the challenges from indigenous scholars are so important, because they really want to broaden that concept. Whether this is still a good word, whether we can sort of broaden it enough, it definitely needs to be either changed, as you say, or broadened, because now we recognize how limited and circumscribed the circumstances in which it emerged was, how it was dictated by who were the decision makers, the colonial powers that were at the table. And I didn't put it in this paper, but even Lemkin himself, let alone the other delegates, they had very, how to put it, I say colonial for the lack of a better word, conceptions of the hierarchies of cultures. They didn't think very highly of very many cultures in the world. Lemkin may have acknowledged the destruction of the cultures. He spoke very highly of the French. He spoke very highly of the Aztec and Maya cultures, but he never mentioned indigenous cultures in North America. Again, these were, certain conceptions of cultures that were ensconced in that particular historical time period. So that word is definitely the way it appeared in the Genocide Convention. It is insufficient. It needs to be critiqued. It has been critiqued.